Most people know what they should do, but knowing is not the hardest part. The hardest part is doing it when you feel tired, distracted, bored, uncertain, or simply do not want to begin. You may sit in front of an important task, feel tension in your body, notice your attention drifting, and tell yourself you will start later. Then another day passes, and you wonder why you keep repeating the same pattern. This audiobook will show you how to change that pattern through practical daily actions. You will learn how to understand why you avoid difficult tasks, protect your strongest hours, act before your emotions take control, reduce distractions, build mental endurance, keep promises to yourself, increase difficulty gradually, and recover without losing consistency. You will not need perfect motivation. You will learn how to rely on deliberate action instead. If you want to become more disciplined and capable of doing what matters, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end. Your next difficult decision may be the one that changes how you see yourself. Chapter 1. Identify why you avoid difficult tasks before changing your daily behavior. You know what you need to do, yet you keep finding reasons not to do it. The assignment sits unfinished. The workout gets moved to tomorrow. The difficult conversation remains unscheduled. The book stays closed while you check your phone for the 10th time. What makes this frustrating is that you are often fully aware of what is happening. You are not confused about the task. You are not missing information. You simply do not want to experience the discomfort that comes with starting. Then, instead of admitting that honestly, your mind produces a more comfortable explanation. You tell yourself you are tired, that you need more time, that you will perform better later, or that today is unusually difficult. Sometimes those explanations are true. But when the same pattern appears repeatedly, the problem is no longer the task itself. The problem is your relationship with discomfort. Avoiding difficult things usually begins long before you actually walk away from them. First comes an internal reaction. You imagine the effort required, the possibility of failure, the boredom involved, or the uncertainty of the outcome. Your body responds with tension. Your attention moves towards something easier, and your mind begins searching for an alternative. This process can happen within seconds. You may not consciously decide, I am going to avoid this. Instead, you open an application, make another cup of coffee, organize something that was not urgent, answer an unimportant message, or decide that you should prepare a little more before beginning. Each action feels reasonable in isolation. The problem becomes visible only when you examine the pattern across days and weeks. Your decisions are gradually being shaped by whatever gives you immediate relief. This is one reason willpower alone is not enough. If every difficult task becomes a private argument between what you know is important and what feels comfortable right now, you will eventually become exhausted from negotiating with yourself. The mind naturally pays attention to immediate consequences. Finishing a major project may create satisfaction later, but checking your phone provides stimulation immediately. Exercising may improve your strength over months, while staying on the couch provides comfort within seconds. Studying for an exam may protect your future opportunities, while watching another episode removes pressure right now. The short-term reward is visible and immediate. The long-term benefit requires patience. When you repeatedly choose the immediate reward, you train yourself to trust temporary feelings more than deliberate decisions. That does not mean you are weak or incapable of discipline. It means your behavior has been conditioned by repetition. Every time you escape a difficult task and feel relief, your brain receives useful information from its perspective. Avoiding discomfort worked. The unpleasant feeling disappeared. The difficult decision was postponed. The pressure became quieter for a while. The next time a similar situation appears, avoidance becomes easier to repeat. This is how a small daily decision can become a strong behavioral pattern. You do not need to hate hard work to avoid it. You only need to become accustomed to removing discomfort whenever it appears. Consider someone who wants to become healthier but consistently postpones exercise. On Monday, they decide they are too tired. On Tuesday, they promise themselves they will begin after work. On Wednesday, they feel guilty about missing the previous days, so exercise now seems even more unpleasant. By Thursday, the goal feels larger than it originally did. Eventually, the person begins questioning their discipline or even their character. But the real issue may be much simpler. They have trained themselves to interpret temporary discomfort as a signal to stop. The solution begins when they stop asking, "How do I make myself feel motivated?" and start asking, "What exactly am I trying to escape?" That question deserves serious attention because different forms of avoidance require different responses. Maybe you avoid a task because you fear doing it badly. Maybe you avoid it because the result could expose your limitations. Maybe you dislike the boredom of repetitive work. Maybe the task is unclear, so beginning creates anxiety. Maybe you are afraid that finishing it will create new responsibilities. Or perhaps you have become accustomed to stimulation and now ordinary focused work feels painfully slow. If you treat all of these problems as a simple lack of motivation, you will keep applying the wrong solution. You cannot solve fear by demanding more excitement from yourself. You cannot solve confusion by shouting at yourself to work harder. Start by observing your avoidance without immediately judging it. The next time you notice yourself delaying something important, pause before changing activities. Ask yourself what you are feeling. Are you anxious about making a mistake? Are you bored? Are you uncertain about where to begin? Are you physically exhausted? Are you expecting the task to require more effort than you believe you can give? Be specific. "I do not feel like doing it" is too vague to teach you anything. "I am worried that my work will not be good enough, so I keep checking messages instead" gives you information. Once the reason becomes visible, you can respond to the actual problem instead of fighting an undefined feeling. There is another important distinction. Genuine limits are not the same as avoidance. Discipline does not mean ignoring sleep, illness, exhaustion, responsibilities, or legitimate constraints. A person who has worked 12 exhausting hours may need recovery. A person who is emotionally overwhelmed may need to stabilize before making an important decision. Responsible self-control includes knowing when effort is appropriate and when recovery is necessary. The danger comes when every moment of resistance is treated as evidence that you should stop. You need enough honesty to distinguish "I cannot reasonably do this right now" from "I do not want to experience the discomfort of doing this right now." Those sentences may produce the same feeling, but they require completely different decisions. A useful practice is to keep one simple record for several days. Whenever you avoid an important task, write down what you intended to do, what you did instead, and what you were feeling immediately before the change. Do not turn this into a complicated productivity system. The purpose is observation. Patterns will begin to appear. Perhaps you always avoid demanding work after lunch. Perhaps you delay tasks when the first step is unclear. Perhaps you become distracted whenever success would require sustained concentration. Perhaps you repeatedly postpone activities where someone else might evaluate your performance. Once you can see the pattern, you gain something more valuable than temporary motivation. You gain a clearer understanding of your own decision-making. This awareness also changes how you speak to yourself. Instead of saying, "I am lazy," you can say, "I have developed a habit of escaping tasks when they become uncomfortable." The second statement is more useful because it describes behavior rather than defining your identity. Behavior can be examined, interrupted, and changed. Personal responsibility does not require self-contempt. In fact, harsh self-judgment often becomes another form of avoidance because it creates so much emotional discomfort that you look for relief instead of taking action. A calm assessment is stronger. You can acknowledge that you made poor decisions yesterday without using yesterday as an excuse to repeat them today. The deeper lesson is that difficult work becomes harder when you continually make your emotions responsible for deciding whether you act. If you only work when you feel prepared, confident, energetic, or inspired, your behavior will remain dependent on conditions you cannot fully control. The first step toward discipline is therefore not forcing yourself to perform enormous amounts of difficult work. It is learning to recognize the exact moment when discomfort begins influencing your decision. That moment is where responsibility becomes practical. You notice the resistance. You understand what created it. Then you decide whether the feeling deserves authority. Once you understand why you avoid difficult things, another problem becomes impossible to ignore. Knowing the reason for your resistance does not automatically make action easier. Awareness gives you clarity, but clarity must eventually become behavior. The next step is to stop waiting for the perfect internal state and deliberately choose one difficult action that you can complete, even when you would rather postpone it. That decision will reveal something important about discipline. You do not build it by demanding that yourself become fearless. You build it by learning to act while discomfort is still present. Chapter 2. Choose one meaningful challenge that strengthens your ability to act. The easiest way to weaken your discipline is to demand too much from yourself at once. You decide that tomorrow will be different, so you create an ambitious schedule, wake up earlier, exercise for an hour, read 50 pages, finish every unfinished task, eliminate every distraction, and somehow remain productive until bedtime. For a few days, the intensity feels satisfying because you can see evidence of change. Then reality arrives. You sleep poorly, work runs late, an unexpected responsibility appears, and the schedule becomes impossible to maintain. When several commitments collapse together, you may conclude that you need more discipline. Often, the more useful conclusion is that you never gave discipline a clear place to develop. You gave yourself too many battles at the same time. If you want to become someone who can reliably do hard things, begin with one meaningful challenge that requires you to act differently from your usual pattern. The word meaningful matters because difficulty alone does not create growth. You can deliberately make your day unpleasant without becoming more disciplined. You could take unnecessarily cold showers, wake up at an extreme hour, or force yourself through exhausting routines that have little connection to the life you actually want. None of those actions automatically makes you stronger. A useful challenge should have a clear relationship with something you value. If your health matters, consistent exercise may be meaningful. If your career matters, completing focused work before checking entertainment may be meaningful. If your relationships matter, having a necessary conversation instead of avoiding it may be meaningful. The challenge should ask you to practice the behavior you eventually want to rely on when circumstances become demanding. This approach changes the purpose of difficulty. You are not suffering simply to prove that you can suffer. You are practicing a specific capacity. Perhaps that capacity is beginning without excessive preparation. Perhaps it is maintaining attention when the work becomes boring. Perhaps it is finishing what you start. Perhaps it is keeping a commitment when nobody else will know whether you kept it. When the challenge has a defined purpose, each repetition teaches you something. You begin to notice how you respond to resistance, how quickly you become distracted, how often you try to renegotiate your commitments, and what conditions make follow-through easier. The challenge becomes a controlled environment in which you can study and strengthen your behavior. Imagine someone who wants to write every day but constantly waits until they have a large block of free time. Their schedule rarely provides one, so writing remains something they intend to do rather than something they consistently practice. Instead of trying to become a completely different person overnight, they choose one meaningful challenge: write for 30 focused minutes before recreational screen time each evening. The value is not the number 30, the value is the decision structure. Writing now has a defined place in the day, and entertainment comes afterward rather than before it. The person is no longer depending on whether they happen to feel inspired. They are practicing the ability to prioritize a chosen responsibility before an easier reward. A challenge also becomes more powerful when you define what success actually means. Vague commitments create constant opportunities for negotiation. "I will work harder" is difficult to measure. "I will spend 45 minutes on the most important task before opening social media" is observable. At the end of the day, you either did it or you did not. This clarity removes unnecessary emotional debate. You do not need to decide again whether the commitment matters. You already decided when you were calm. The task now is simply to follow the decision. That is an important part of self-control, making important choices before pressure, fatigue, or temptation arrives. There is a psychological benefit to this kind of commitment that is easy to underestimate. Every completed challenge provides evidence about your capacity to act, not evidence that you are superior to other people, and not proof that you will always succeed, but evidence that your behavior can be directed intentionally. This matters because confidence in discipline is built differently from confidence in talent. Talent can produce confidence when things come naturally. Discipline becomes more credible when you repeatedly act despite inconvenience. When you complete a difficult commitment several times, you begin to trust your decisions more because your past behavior supports them. But there is a danger in choosing the wrong challenge. If you select something so difficult that failure becomes almost inevitable, you may strengthen discouragement rather than discipline. If you choose something so easy that it requires no meaningful adjustment, you learn very little. The right challenge should create resistance without requiring unreasonable force. It should make you pause before doing it. You should sometimes prefer not to do it, yet you should still have a realistic ability to complete it under ordinary circumstances. That balance is important because the purpose is not to test the maximum amount of suffering you can tolerate. The purpose is to increase your ability to choose deliberately when comfort is available. Think about someone trying to improve their physical fitness after years of inactivity. If they decide to train intensely for 2 hours every morning, they may feel determined on the first day, but the plan may exceed their current capacity. A more intelligent challenge could be a consistent 20-minute walk, followed by a short strength routine. It may seem modest, but if the person previously avoided exercise completely, this commitment creates a real behavioral change. More importantly, it gives them repeated opportunities to practice showing up. After several weeks, the challenge can become more demanding. Progress becomes an adjustment based on evidence rather than an emotional decision made during a moment of excitement. This is where responsibility becomes different from self-punishment. Responsibility asks, what level of effort can I realistically commit to, and will I honor it? Self-punishment asks, how difficult can I make this so I can prove that I am serious? The first question builds sustainable discipline. The second can produce short bursts of intensity followed by exhaustion. A stoic approach to self-control is not about creating unnecessary hardship. It is about directing your effort toward what deserves it and accepting that meaningful improvement requires repeated action. You do not need to make your life harder in every possible way. You need to become more dependable in the areas that matter. Your chosen challenge should also be narrow enough that you can recognize the exact behavior you are trying to strengthen. Suppose you want to become more productive. Be productive all day gives you no useful target because productivity can mean almost anything. Instead, choose a behavior such as completing the most demanding work task before checking non-essential messages. Now you are training a specific ability, giving priority to important work before responding to every incoming demand. If you want to become more courageous, choose one uncomfortable conversation you have been postponing and prepare for it carefully. If you want to improve your learning, choose a daily period in which you study without switching between applications. The clearer the behavior, the easier it becomes to evaluate yourself honestly. There is another reason to choose only one challenge at first. Your attention is limited. Every new rule requires mental energy. If you attempt to change 10 behaviors simultaneously, you create 10 opportunities to question, postpone, modify, or abandon your commitments. One serious challenge creates a much cleaner test. You can observe what happens before, during, and after the action. You can identify the exact point where resistance appears. You can adjust your environment. You can discover whether the problem is timing, preparation, distraction, fatigue, uncertainty, or simple reluctance. Instead of collecting ambitious plans, you are collecting useful information about how you actually operate. The challenge should remain important enough that missing it has consequences you genuinely care about, but not so emotionally loaded that one imperfect day becomes a personal crisis. You are building a relationship with consistency, not chasing a flawless record. If you fail once, examine the conditions that produced the failure. Was the commitment unrealistic? Did you make the decision too late? Did another responsibility interfere? Did you leave an obvious distraction within reach? Then make the necessary adjustment and continue. The objective is not to protect an image of yourself as perfectly disciplined. The objective is to become increasingly capable of correcting your behavior without abandoning responsibility. Eventually, something interesting begins to happen. The challenge that once required conscious effort starts becoming familiar. The action may still be difficult, but the internal resistance becomes less influential because you have repeated the decision enough times. You have created a small area of life in which your intentions and actions are becoming more closely aligned. That is where genuine discipline begins to become visible. Not when everything feels easy, but when one meaningful commitment becomes dependable enough that you no longer need a dramatic emotional push to honor it. Yet, choosing the right challenge creates another question. Even when the commitment is meaningful, clearly defined, and realistically demanding, there will still be moments when you know exactly what you promised yourself and still want to delay. The challenge has been selected. The reason is clear. The decision has been made, but the mind will still search for a better time to begin. And that raises the next problem. How do you act when the moment arrives and your emotions strongly prefer that you wait? Chapter 3: Schedule demanding tasks when your energy and focus are strongest. You can have a clear goal, a meaningful challenge, and a sincere commitment to follow through, yet still make poor decisions about when to do the work. Many people treat time as if every hour has the same value. They look at an empty space on a calendar and assume that if they place an important task there, they will have the same ability to complete it as they would at any other point in the day. But your capacity for difficult thinking changes. Your attention rises and falls. Your patience changes. Your ability to resist distraction changes. Even your willingness to tolerate frustration can be very different at 8 in the morning compared with 9 at night. If you repeatedly schedule your hardest responsibilities when your mental resources are depleted, You may mistake a scheduling problem for a discipline problem. Consider someone who spends the first hours of the morning responding to messages, checking news, reviewing minor requests, and handling easy administrative tasks. By the time the demanding project begins, the person has already made hundreds of small decisions. Their attention has been divided among other people's priorities, notifications, and unfinished details. They sit down to do the work that actually matters and immediately feel resistance. The project seems harder than expected. They become restless, check another message, get a drink, adjust their workspace, and eventually tell themselves they are having trouble concentrating. Nothing mysterious happened. They spent their strongest period of attention on low-value activities and reserved their weakest period for the work requiring the most control. This is why discipline should include the intelligent management of energy. Responsibility does not mean treating every hour equally. It means understanding your own operating conditions and arranging your day so that important decisions are made when you are most capable of making them well. A person who knows that their concentration is strongest early in the day should not casually give that period away. A person who thinks more clearly in the afternoon should protect that window instead. There is no universal perfect hour. The useful question is personal. When am I consistently most capable of sustained attention, clear judgment, and controlled effort? You can discover this without complicated tracking. For several days, pay attention to 3 things: when your mind feels clear, when you become easily distracted, and when difficult work begins to feel unnecessarily irritating. Notice what happens before those periods. Sleep affects you. Food affects you. Meetings affect you. Exercise affects you. Screen exposure affects you. Even the type of work you completed earlier can influence what remains available for the next task. You are not trying to create a perfect scientific measurement of your day. You are trying to recognize patterns that are already present. Most people know when they are mentally sharp and when they are mentally drained, but they rarely organize their responsibilities around that knowledge. Once you identify your strongest period, protect it from work that does not require your best thinking. This can be uncomfortable because easy tasks often feel productive. Answering emails creates visible movement. Organizing files creates a sense of completion. Cleaning your desk produces an immediate result. Checking messages makes you feel connected and informed. But the fact that an activity is useful does not mean it deserves your best attention. If a task can be completed adequately when your energy is lower, consider moving it there. Save your stronger mental state for responsibilities where quality, persistence, judgment, or creativity actually matter. This principle becomes especially important when your demanding task requires concentration rather than physical effort. Reading difficult material, writing, studying, planning a business decision, solving technical problems, learning a complex skill, or preparing for an important conversation all require more than available time. They require cognitive resources. If you approach them after a long sequence of interruptions, your brain must spend additional effort simply regaining context. The work itself may not have changed, but the cost of entering it has. That is why a task can take 2 hours on one day and 4 hours on another, without any obvious difference in ability. The same idea applies outside professional work. A parent may know that a difficult conversation with a child requires patience, yet choose to have it immediately after a stressful workday. A person trying to repair a relationship may attempt an important discussion late at night when both people are exhausted. Someone trying to make a serious financial decision may do it while mentally drained after a long day. In each situation, timing influences the quality of self-control available. You cannot control every circumstance, But when you have a choice, it is responsible to make important decisions under conditions that support clear judgment rather than conditions that make impulsive reactions more likely. There is also a subtle psychological benefit to scheduling demanding work in your strongest period. It reduces the number of hours you spend anticipating the task. Suppose you have an important report to complete, but decide to work on it sometime after dinner. From morning until evening, the unfinished task remains in the background. You may enjoy parts of your day, but the knowledge that the difficult work is waiting creates a low level of tension. When the evening arrives, you are tired and the task feels even less attractive. Now you are not only doing difficult work, you are also fighting accumulated resistance. By placing it earlier, you can remove that prolonged anticipation and experience the relief of having handled an important responsibility before the day becomes crowded. Scheduling also changes the role of motivation. If your demanding task has a fixed place in your day, you do not need to repeatedly decide when to begin. The decision is made in advance. This matters because repeated decision-making creates opportunities for emotional negotiation. At 7:30 in the morning, you may be willing to work. At 7:45, you may decide to check something quickly. At 8:10, you may convince yourself that starting at 9 would be better. By 9:30, another obligation appears. A vague intention leaves room for the day to decide for you. A defined appointment with yourself creates a stronger expectation that the task will happen. But scheduling alone is not enough. You must also protect the beginning of the work period. If you place 2 hours of focused work on your calendar while leaving your phone beside you with notifications enabled, you have planned the time but not the conditions. Before the session begins, remove unnecessary interruptions, close irrelevant applications, prepare the materials you need, decide what the first action will be. If possible, tell people when you will be unavailable. The goal is not to create an artificial environment where nothing unexpected can happen. The goal is to remove predictable distractions that you already know will compete for your attention. There is an important distinction between planning around your energy and using your energy as an excuse. You might discover that you are usually tired in the afternoon, but that does not mean every demanding responsibility must be avoided then. Sometimes circumstances require effort at an inconvenient time. The purpose of scheduling is not to guarantee comfort. It is to use favorable conditions when they are available. When they are not available, discipline still matters. If an important task must be completed at 7 p.m., you do not abandon the responsibility because 9 a.m. would have been better. You adjust, reduce distractions, and work with the resources you have. Your schedule should therefore reflect priorities rather than merely record obligations. Many calendars become crowded because people schedule everything that appears urgent while leaving little protected space for what is genuinely important. Meetings receive specific times. Appointments receive specific times. Other people's requests receive specific times. But personal development, focused work, exercise, learning, and difficult conversations are often left in a vague category called later. Later is not a reliable time. It is an invitation for competing demands to take priority. There is another practical adjustment that can make demanding work easier. Match the type of task to the type of energy you have. High focus periods can be reserved for complex thinking. Moderate energy periods can handle communication, planning, or routine problem solving. Lower energy periods can be used for administrative work, preparation, simple errands, or recovery. This does not mean every day will fit neatly into 3 categories. Life is rarely that predictable, but when you begin thinking this way, you stop asking only, "When do I have time?" and start asking, "What kind of capacity do I have at that time?" That question produces much better decisions. Over time, you may notice that your strongest period becomes associated with meaningful work. When that happens, starting becomes psychologically easier because your schedule begins reinforcing your priorities. You are no longer hoping that enough energy will remain after everything else is finished. You are deliberately spending your best attention on something you have decided matters. That is a quiet form of self-respect. You are treating your future as important enough to receive your best effort rather than whatever remains at the end of the day. Yet, even with excellent timing, protected attention, and a carefully chosen schedule, one problem remains. Eventually, the scheduled moment arrives, the environment is ready, the task is in front of you, and you still feel the impulse to delay. The mind can produce convincing reasons even when the timing is perfect. At that point, better planning has done its job, and another skill becomes necessary. You must learn what to do in the exact moment when action feels less attractive than avoidance, because that moment is where your schedule ends and your discipline is truly tested. Chapter 4. Start difficult work before negotiating with your changing emotions. The moment you decide to begin difficult work, your mind may suddenly become extremely creative. You remember a message that needs answering, a small task that could be finished first, something you forgot to organize, or an article you wanted to read. You may even discover a reasonable concern about whether this is the right time to start. Nothing about the thought seems dishonest. It may sound responsible, practical, and intelligent, but sometimes the mind is not trying to solve a problem. It is trying to postpone discomfort while making the postponement feel justified. The important skill is learning to recognize that difference before another hour disappears. Emotions are useful sources of information, but they are poor permanent decision makers. Fear can warn you about genuine danger. Fatigue can tell you that recovery may be necessary. Frustration can reveal that something is not working. Anxiety can signal uncertainty that deserves attention. But the presence of an emotion does not automatically determine the correct action. Feeling resistance before starting a difficult task does not prove that the task should be delayed. Feeling bored does not prove that the work is unnecessary. Feeling unprepared does not always mean more preparation is required. Mature self-control begins when you can notice an emotion without immediately assigning it authority over your behavior. This distinction becomes especially important because emotions often change after action begins. Before a workout, you may feel reluctant. 10 minutes later, your body is engaged and the resistance has decreased. Before studying, you may feel mentally restless. After several minutes of focused attention, the material begins to make sense and continuing becomes easier. Before making an important phone call, you may feel anxious. After the conversation begins, the anxiety may become manageable because uncertainty has been replaced by actual information. If you always wait for the emotion to improve before acting, you create a condition that may never occur. Sometimes the emotion changes because you acted first. This is why the first few minutes deserve unusual attention. Starting is not the same as completing. You do not need to mentally accept every hour of difficult work before you begin the first 10 minutes. That expectation can make a task feel larger than it needs to be. Instead, reduce the psychological demand of the beginning without reducing the importance of the task itself. Open the document, put on the appropriate clothes, place the required materials in front of you, write the first sentence, read the first page, solve the first problem. The objective is to move from thinking about action to performing action before the mind has enough time to construct a long negotiation. A person preparing for an important exam provides a clear example. They sit at their desk and think about how much material remains. The amount creates anxiety. Anxiety creates a desire to escape. The person checks their phone, feels guilty, and then thinks even more about the exam. A better response is not to demand confidence. It is to define the first concrete action and begin before evaluating the entire workload. They might choose one section and work through it for a fixed period. Once they begin, they gain information about what they actually understand and what needs attention. Action replaces speculation. That change alone can significantly alter the emotional experience. The same principle applies to work that involves uncertainty. Suppose you need to create a presentation, but you do not know exactly what the final version should look like. Waiting until you feel certain can become an endless delay because certainty often develops through engagement with the problem. The first draft may be incomplete, it may even be poor, but it creates something you can evaluate. You now have evidence. You can revise an existing idea more easily than you can improve an idea that exists only in your head. Starting before complete confidence is available teaches you to tolerate temporary uncertainty instead of requiring emotional certainty before taking responsibility. There is also a difference between preparation and emotional permission. Preparation asks whether you have the resources required to perform the task. Emotional permission asks whether you currently feel comfortable enough to perform it. These are not the same question. You may have everything necessary to begin a difficult report, but still wish you felt more focused. You may have enough information to make a decision, but still wish you felt more certain. You may know exactly what workout you need, but wish you felt more energetic. If you confuse comfort with readiness, you can spend a great deal of time waiting for a feeling that is not required. A practical discipline is to establish a rule for yourself about the beginning of demanding work. When the scheduled time arrives, do not ask whether you feel like starting. Ask what the first physical action is. This sounds simple, but the wording matters. Do I want to work? Invites an emotional evaluation. What is the first action? Moves attention toward execution. The first question allows your mood to become the central issue. The second assumes that the decision has already been made and only the next behavior remains. This does not eliminate emotions. It places them in their proper position. You should also become careful with the phrase, "I will do it later." Later sounds harmless because it does not mean never. But repeated postponement teaches your mind that commitments are negotiable whenever discomfort appears. If you decide to delay, make the decision deliberately rather than automatically. Ask what objective reason justifies the change. If there is one, reschedule the task at a specific time. If there is no clear reason beyond reluctance, begin. This creates an important separation between flexible judgment and impulsive avoidance. You are allowed to change plans. You are not required to obey every impulse to change them. This becomes particularly difficult when the emotion is strong. Perhaps you are afraid of receiving criticism. Perhaps you feel ashamed about how far behind you are. Perhaps you are angry and want to avoid a responsibility because you believe someone else caused the problem. In these moments, starting may feel almost unfair, yet discipline is not the denial of emotional reality. It is the ability to recognize what you feel while deciding what your values require. You can be nervous and still make the call. You can be embarrassed and still open the document. You can be frustrated and still complete the necessary responsibility. Emotional discomfort does not have to disappear before responsible behavior becomes possible. There will also be days when the right decision really is to stop or delay. That is why self-control cannot be reduced to constant force. If you are genuinely exhausted, continuing may damage the quality of your work and your ability to function tomorrow. If new information changes the importance of a task, Adjusting the plan may be rational. If a situation has become unsafe or unreasonable, refusing to continue may be responsible. The discipline is not in always saying yes to effort. The discipline is in making the decision based on reality rather than allowing a temporary emotional state to make the decision automatically. One way to develop this skill is to pay attention to the difference between resistance before action and resistance during action. Before beginning, your mind predicts how unpleasant something will be. During the task, you experience what is actually happening. Those two experiences are often different. A 30-minute workout may feel overwhelming while you are sitting on the couch, but manageable once you are moving. Writing a difficult email may feel emotionally enormous before you open the draft, but surprisingly straightforward after the first paragraph. Cleaning a neglected room may feel like an entire afternoon of misery until you begin and discover that the first section takes 15 minutes. Your predictions are not always accurate, so they should not automatically control your decisions. Over time, this changes your relationship with uncomfortable feelings. You stop treating them as commands and begin treating them as experiences that can exist alongside deliberate action. That is a major development in self-control. You no longer need to win an internal argument before beginning. You can simply notice the reluctance, accept that it is present, and take the next required step. This approach is quieter than motivational excitement, but it is more dependable because it does not require a particular mood. The deeper challenge, however, is that modern life provides endless ways to escape the moment when discomfort appears. A phone can provide stimulation instantly. Entertainment can remove boredom immediately. Notifications can give you something else to respond to. Even productive-looking activities can become convenient substitutes for the one responsibility you are avoiding. If you want your decisions to remain yours, you must become more deliberate about what you allow into the moments immediately before difficult work begins. That is why starting promptly is not merely a productivity technique. It is practice in governing your own behavior. Each time you begin before unnecessary negotiation takes over, you reinforce the idea that your commitments do not depend entirely on your current emotional preference. Each time you postpone without a legitimate reason, you strengthen the opposite pattern. Neither choice changes your life dramatically in a single moment, but repeated decisions gradually determine what kind of person you become under pressure. Eventually, the question becomes more demanding than whether you can start difficult work. It becomes whether you can continue when the initial decision has been made and the discomfort does not disappear. Beginning proves that you can overcome hesitation. Continuing proves that you can tolerate sustained effort. And that is where another form of resistance appears, one that does not arrive before the task, but grows quietly after you have already started: distraction. When the work becomes repetitive, uncomfortable, or mentally tiring, what will you do when your attention begins searching for an easier place to go? Chapter 5. Reduce distractions that make challenging tasks easier to postpone. Distraction rarely begins with an obvious decision to abandon your work. More often, it begins with something that appears harmless. You glance at a notification, you answer one message, you check a headline while waiting for a file to load. You open a browser tab because you suddenly remember something unrelated. Each interruption may take only a few seconds, yet the real cost is larger than the time displayed on the clock. Your attention has to reconstruct what you were doing, remember where you stopped, and rebuild the mental state required to continue. When this happens repeatedly, difficult work becomes more exhausting than it needs to be. You may eventually believe that you lack concentration when the deeper problem is that your environment keeps asking your attention to leave. This matters because challenging tasks already require a significant amount of mental control. when you are writing, studying, solving a complex problem, exercising carefully, or making an important decision, part of your mind must hold the goal in place while resisting competing impulses. Every unnecessary interruption adds another demand. You are not simply choosing between work and entertainment. You are repeatedly forcing yourself to switch between different mental contexts. Over time, that switching creates frustration, reduces depth, and makes the original responsibility feel unusually difficult. The task has not necessarily become harder, your attention has become divided. A useful way to understand distraction is to stop thinking only about what you are distracted by and start examining what the distraction gives you. A phone may give you novelty, social media may give you social stimulation, news may give you a sense of being informed, email may give you the feeling that you are responding to responsibilities. Even cleaning your workspace may give you a feeling of control when the real task feels uncertain. Distraction often succeeds because it provides an immediate psychological reward. The difficult task asks for sustained effort without guaranteed satisfaction. The distraction offers something now. Recognizing this changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why can't I focus?" you can ask, "What reward am I receiving when I leave the task?" Consider a person working from home who needs to prepare a detailed report. They begin with good intentions, but their phone remains beside the keyboard. A notification appears. They check it. Then another message leads to another application. 10 minutes later, they return to the report and realize they have forgotten what they were about to write. They reread the previous paragraph and begin again. 20 minutes later, another notification appears. By the end of the afternoon, they have spent hours at the desk, but completed far less than expected. Their conclusion may be that they are bad at focused work. A more accurate conclusion is that they repeatedly placed a powerful source of interruption within immediate reach during a task that required sustained attention. This is why self-control should not be treated as the only defense against distraction. If you know that something reliably interferes with an important responsibility, deliberately increasing the distance between you and that distraction is a rational act. Put the phone in another room. Turn off unnecessary notifications. Close applications that are unrelated to the current task. Use a separate browser profile for focused work if needed. Keep only the materials required for the immediate responsibility in front of you. These actions may seem ordinary, but they change the number of decisions you must make while working. Good discipline does not constantly prove its strength by resisting temptation at close range. It often prevents unnecessary temptation from entering the situation in the first place. There is a deeper principle here. Your environment influences which behavior requires effort. If entertainment is one click away and meaningful work requires several steps, your surroundings are quietly favoring avoidance. If your study materials are prepared and your phone is inaccessible, beginning becomes easier. If unhealthy snacks are constantly visible, resisting them requires repeated decisions. If your exercise clothes are ready and your equipment is accessible, the physical barrier to starting is smaller. None of these changes removes personal responsibility. They simply recognize that human behavior is influenced by immediate surroundings. You can take responsibility for your environment just as seriously as you take responsibility for your intentions. Another source of distraction is unfinished mental business. Sometimes you sit down to concentrate, but your mind keeps producing reminders. You need to call someone. You remember an unpaid bill. You suddenly think about something you need to buy. You wonder whether you responded to an earlier email. Because the mind does not want to lose these thoughts, it keeps bringing them back. One practical solution is to keep a simple place nearby where you can record these thoughts without acting on them. Write down the reminder and return to the task. You are not ignoring the responsibility. You are creating a trusted place for it, so that it does not have to compete for attention every 30 seconds. This technique is especially valuable because distraction can disguise itself as responsibility. You may tell yourself that checking your email is productive because someone might be waiting for a response. But if you are supposed to be writing an important proposal, the question is not whether email is useful. The question is whether it deserves your attention during that particular period. A responsible person does not respond to every demand immediately. Responsibility also involves deciding what deserves attention now and what can wait. Without that judgment, every incoming request becomes capable of interrupting your priorities. The same problem appears in learning. A student may sit down to study with a laptop, phone, music, messaging applications, and several browser tabs open. They believe they are using technology to support their education. In reality, each open channel creates a possible shift in attention. They read a difficult paragraph, encounter something they do not understand, and immediately search for an easier or more stimulating activity. The problem is not always lack of intelligence or interest. Difficulty creates a moment of uncertainty, and the available distractions provide an immediate exit. If the student removes those exits during study periods, they create more opportunities to remain with the difficult material long enough for understanding to develop. Distraction can also come from other people. Colleagues may interrupt you with questions that could wait. Friends may expect immediate responses. Family members may assume that because you are physically present, you are available. In some circumstances, you cannot prevent interruptions. But when you have control, communicating boundaries is part of disciplined work. You can tell someone that you need a specific period without interruption and give them a clear time when you will be available again. This is not selfishness. It is a recognition that focused work requires conditions that casual conversation does not. There is also an internal form of distraction that deserves attention: unnecessary task switching. You may avoid one difficult responsibility by replacing it with another useful responsibility. You start answering emails, organizing documents, researching a minor detail, or improving something that is not urgent. Because the replacement task is productive, you feel less guilty. But productive avoidance is still avoidance when it consistently prevents the most important responsibility from receiving attention. The solution is not to stop doing secondary tasks. It is to become honest about the order in which they deserve to be done. One practical habit is to decide what must remain untouched during a focused work period. This is more effective than simply telling yourself to concentrate. Focus is an abstract instruction. During the next 40 minutes, I will not check messages, browse unrelated sites, or switch to another task is a behavioral boundary. You know exactly what you are protecting. If an unrelated thought appears, you do not need to solve it immediately. If a notification arrives, you do not need to investigate it. If boredom appears, you do not need to remove it. You allow the feeling to exist without allowing it to determine your next action. At first, this can feel strangely uncomfortable. Without constant stimulation, ordinary work may seem slower. You may notice boredom that was previously hidden by rapid switching. You may become aware of how often you reach for your phone without consciously deciding to do so. This awareness can be unsettling because it reveals how automatic some behaviors have become. But that discomfort is useful information. It shows you the difference between genuine need and conditioned response. Once you can see the impulse clearly, you gain an opportunity to choose rather than react. Over time, reducing distraction creates another benefit that goes beyond productivity. You begin to rebuild your tolerance for sustained attention. Difficult work stops being interrupted every time your mind becomes restless. You learn that boredom can be present without requiring entertainment. You learn that uncertainty can be present without requiring immediate escape. You learn that another message can wait. These are not merely work skills. They are forms of self-control that influence how you read, listen, think, exercise, communicate, and make decisions. Still, even the best environment cannot remove every distraction. There will be unexpected messages, difficult emotions, interruptions, fatigue, and moments when your attention simply wants to leave. The goal is not to construct a life in which distraction never appears. The goal is to become less dependent on distraction for relief. Once the obvious interruptions are removed, you may discover something more challenging. The strongest distractions are sometimes internal. Your own mind can create reasons to stop even when nothing outside you is competing for attention. And when the environment becomes quiet, that internal resistance becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 6. Practice staying uncomfortable long enough to build stronger mental endurance. There is a moment in almost every difficult task when the discomfort stops being theoretical and becomes physical. Your attention feels tired, your patience becomes thinner, the work starts to feel repetitive. You begin noticing everything you would rather be doing. A simple task suddenly seems unnecessarily demanding, and your mind starts producing reasonable arguments for stopping. This is the point where many people assume they have reached their limit, but often they have reached something different, the edge of their current tolerance. That distinction matters because capacity and tolerance are not identical. You may be capable of continuing even though continuing feels unpleasant. Learning to recognize that difference is one of the foundations of mental endurance. Mental endurance is not the ability to remain comfortable while doing difficult things. It is the ability to remain deliberate while discomfort is present. That discomfort can take many forms. Sometimes it is boredom. Sometimes it is frustration, uncertainty, embarrassment, physical tiredness, or the feeling that progress is too slow. A student may understand the material but become restless after 40 minutes of study. An employee may know exactly how to complete a report but become irritated by the repetitive details. A person learning a new skill may understand that improvement requires practice but feel discouraged because the results are not appearing quickly. In each situation, the uncomfortable feeling creates pressure to change behavior. Endurance begins when you can experience that pressure without automatically obeying it. The mistake is to believe that every unpleasant feeling needs to be resolved immediately. Modern life makes immediate relief extremely easy. If you are bored, you can find entertainment. If you are frustrated, you can switch tasks. If you are uncomfortable, you can distract yourself. If you are uncertain, you can keep researching instead of deciding. These options are useful when used deliberately, but they can become harmful when they teach you that discomfort should always be removed as soon as it appears. When that expectation becomes habitual, ordinary difficulty begins to feel unacceptable. You do not necessarily become less capable. You become less willing to remain with the experience of effort. This is why endurance should be practiced gradually rather than demanded suddenly. If you normally concentrate for 15 minutes before checking your phone, attempting 4 uninterrupted hours immediately may create unnecessary strain. Instead, extend the period slightly. Stay with the task when you first notice the urge to escape. Give yourself another 5 or 10 minutes before deciding whether you truly need a break. The purpose is not to punish yourself. You are learning that the first signal of discomfort does not have to determine the next action. Each successful extension gives you direct evidence that an uncomfortable state can be experienced without immediate interruption. Imagine someone trying to read a difficult book. After 20 pages, the material becomes dense and their attention starts wandering. Previously, they would stop and open their phone. Instead, they decide to remain with the book for another 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, they may still feel restless. They may not suddenly become enthusiastic, but they discover that the restlessness rises and falls. A difficult paragraph becomes understandable after rereading it. Their attention returns. They continue. The important achievement is not the number of pages. It is the discovery that discomfort does not necessarily continue increasing until it becomes unbearable. That discovery can change how you interpret resistance. Before practicing endurance, you may see discomfort as evidence that something is wrong. After practicing it, you begin to see discomfort as information that you have entered a demanding part of the process. This does not mean every uncomfortable situation deserves persistence. Some discomfort signals genuine danger or excessive strain. The point is to become more precise. Instead of asking, "How do I make this feeling disappear?" ask, "What is this feeling telling me, and does it require action?" Sometimes the answer will be yes. Sometimes the answer will be no. The ability to make that distinction is more valuable than simply becoming tougher. There is also an important difference between intensity and duration. People often think mental strength is demonstrated by doing extremely difficult things for short periods, but many important responsibilities are not dramatic. They require steady effort over long stretches of ordinary time. Paying attention during a long meeting, practicing a skill after the excitement has disappeared, finishing a tedious project, studying material that is not immediately interesting, or maintaining a responsibility when nobody is praising you, all require endurance. The challenge is rarely a single moment of heroic effort. It is the repeated decision to remain engaged after novelty has disappeared. This is where boredom becomes especially important. Boredom is often treated as an enemy, but it can reveal how dependent your attention has become on constant stimulation. If every quiet moment is filled with a screen, music, conversation, or new information, your mind has fewer opportunities to experience sustained low stimulation. Then ordinary tasks can feel unusually difficult because they do not provide continuous novelty. Practicing boredom tolerance can therefore strengthen your ability to work without needing constant emotional rewards. You can sit with a simple task, allow the mind to become restless, and continue without immediately searching for something more stimulating. A practical way to train this is to choose small periods during which you intentionally remain with one activity without adding stimulation. Read without checking your phone. Walk without constantly consuming content. Eat without watching a video. Work without changing applications unnecessarily. These moments are not valuable because silence is morally superior to entertainment. They are valuable because they teach your attention that it does not need continuous novelty to remain functional. When you become less dependent on stimulation, difficult work becomes less emotionally expensive. Endurance also requires learning how to interpret temporary failure. Suppose you commit to a demanding task and lose focus after 30 minutes. You might conclude that you lack discipline and abandon the effort. The more useful response is to examine what happened. Were you genuinely tired? Did you become distracted? Was the task poorly defined? Did frustration appear because you encountered something you did not understand? The purpose of endurance training is not to create an identity in which you never struggle. It is to become better at recovering from the moment when your control weakens. Resilience grows through correction, not through pretending that difficulty never affects you. This perspective is especially valuable when progress is slow. A person learning a language may practice for months before feeling confident. Someone developing physical strength may train consistently without dramatic visible changes. A writer may produce pages that need substantial revision. During these periods, emotional rewards become less reliable. The work still matters, but the evidence of improvement may be subtle. If you require immediate proof that your effort is working, you may abandon the process too early. Endurance means allowing worthwhile processes to develop at their natural pace while continuing to evaluate whether your approach is actually sound. There is a stoic quality to this way of thinking because it separates your responsibility from the emotional experience surrounding it. You are responsible for choosing the effort, preparing intelligently, and responding to circumstances. You are not responsible for making every moment feel satisfying. You cannot command enthusiasm to appear. You cannot guarantee that difficult work will become enjoyable. What you can control is whether a temporary feeling automatically changes a decision you already made for a considered reason. That is where self-command becomes practical rather than theoretical. You should also pay attention to the language you use during discomfort. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "I cannot stand this," the statement can increase the sense of threat. A more accurate observation might be, "This is difficult, and I can remain with it for another 10 minutes." The second statement does not deny the experience. It narrows the problem to something manageable. You are not promising that the entire task will feel easy. You are deciding that the current moment does not require escape. This makes endurance concrete rather than abstract. Another useful practice is to stop measuring every difficult session by how productive it felt. Sometimes the most valuable session is one in which you learn that you can remain engaged despite frustration. You may complete less than expected and still strengthen an important capacity. That does not mean productivity is irrelevant. It means performance and training are not always identical. A difficult day can produce useful information about your limits, your habits, and your recovery needs. If you evaluate yourself only by output, you may overlook the behavioral skill being developed underneath the result. As your tolerance improves, you will notice that difficult tasks become less emotionally threatening. You still experience fatigue, boredom, frustration, and resistance, but those feelings no longer carry the same urgency. You have seen them before. You know that they can rise without controlling you. You know that a difficult period can end without immediate escape. You know that attention can return after wandering. This familiarity creates a quieter form of confidence. You do not need to believe that you can handle everything. You simply know that discomfort itself is not enough to make you abandon something important. But endurance has another requirement that is easy to overlook. You cannot ask your mind and body to tolerate increasing levels of difficulty indefinitely without understanding recovery. Pushing beyond every limit is not discipline. Sometimes the strongest decision is to stop before exhaustion turns useful effort into damage. The real skill is knowing the difference between discomfort that should be tolerated and fatigue that should be respected. That distinction becomes increasingly important as you ask yourself to do harder things more consistently, because the next stage of discipline is not simply enduring more, it is learning how to make promises to yourself that you can continue honoring. Chapter 7. Strengthen discipline by keeping promises you repeatedly make yourself. You can make a promise to yourself in complete sincerity and still break it a few hours later. You decide that you will exercise after work, finish the report before dinner, study for an hour, or wake up at a certain time. When the moment arrives, however, your energy is lower, your schedule has changed, or another activity suddenly seems more important. You postpone the commitment and tell yourself you will make up for it tomorrow. Nothing dramatic happens. The world continues normally. But something inside the relationship you have with yourself has changed. When this pattern happens repeatedly, the problem is no longer only whether you completed the task. You begin teaching yourself that your own decisions are provisional. Self-discipline becomes stronger, when your words to yourself become credible. That credibility does not come from making impressive promises. It comes from making commitments carefully and then honoring them consistently. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you will do something and repeatedly choose not to, your mind learns that intentions have little force. You may still want the result. You may still feel disappointed. You may even become highly motivated for short periods. But motivation cannot compensate indefinitely for a damaged sense of personal reliability. A person who trusts their own commitments behaves differently from someone who expects themselves to negotiate every promise once discomfort appears. This is why discipline has a private dimension that other people rarely see. Nobody may know whether you completed the workout you promised yourself. Nobody may know whether you studied when you said you would. Nobody may know whether you spent the evening on meaningful work or quietly abandoned the plan. External accountability can help, but there is a deeper form of accountability that exists when you know exactly what you told yourself and what you actually did. That private record shapes your self-respect. You do not need to announce your discipline. You need to become someone whose behavior is increasingly consistent with deliberate decisions. The quality of the promise matters. Many people make commitments while emotionally excited, after watching an inspiring video, receiving criticism, seeing someone else's success, or becoming frustrated with their current situation. They create an ambitious plan. The plan feels powerful because the emotion behind it is powerful, but emotional intensity is not the same as reliable commitment. A better approach is to make important promises when your judgment is calm. Decide what you can realistically do under ordinary conditions, consider the obstacles that are likely to appear, and choose a standard you can maintain. A smaller commitment that survives ordinary inconvenience is more valuable than an extreme commitment that collapses when enthusiasm fades. Suppose you tell yourself that you will exercise every day for 90 minutes. You miss one day because of an unexpected responsibility, then miss another because you are exhausted, and soon the entire plan feels broken. A more intelligent commitment might be to exercise for 30 minutes on specific days and maintain a shorter minimum when circumstances become unusually difficult. This is not lowering your standards out of weakness. It is designing a commitment around reality. Discipline requires structure, but structure that ignores reality becomes fragile. The goal is to create a promise strong enough to guide you and flexible enough to survive legitimate changes in circumstances. There is another important distinction between keeping a promise and completing a task perfectly. Imagine that you commit to studying for 1 hour. After 20 minutes, you realize you are struggling to understand the material. You become frustrated and spend the next 40 minutes distracted. At the end, you might tell yourself that you failed because the hour was not productive. But perhaps the real commitment was to give the hour your honest attention. If you stayed engaged, confronted confusion, reviewed difficult material, and continued working despite frustration, the session may have been successful even without perfect results. Keeping promises requires evaluating whether you honored the intended behavior, not whether circumstances produced the ideal outcome. This perspective becomes especially useful when life interrupts your plans. A disciplined person is not someone whose schedule is never disrupted. A disciplined person knows how to respond when disruption occurs without turning one interruption into permission to abandon everything. If you miss your morning workout because of an urgent responsibility, the next question is not whether the entire week is ruined. It is what responsible action is still possible. Perhaps you exercise later. Perhaps you move the session to another day. Perhaps you accept that today genuinely cannot accommodate it and return tomorrow. The important thing is that you make the adjustment deliberately rather than allowing disappointment to make the decision for you. Your relationship with promises also improves when you stop making commitments simply because they sound impressive. There is a subtle temptation to use ambitious plans as evidence of seriousness. Saying you will wake up at 5, read 50 pages, exercise for 2 hours, work 10 focused hours, and eliminate every distraction can produce an immediate feeling of control. But a promise is not valuable because it sounds demanding. It is valuable because it changes behavior. Before committing to something, ask whether you are prepared to honor it after the initial excitement disappears. If the answer is uncertain, reduce the commitment until it becomes credible. This creates an interesting psychological shift. Instead of using promises to describe the person you hope to become, you begin using them to direct the person you are becoming today. The difference is subtle but important. I am going to completely transform my life is an identity statement with no immediate behavioral precision. I will complete this one difficult responsibility before I allow myself to move on to entertainment creates a decision you can actually test. Each time you keep such a commitment, you strengthen the connection between intention and action. Over time, that connection becomes more dependable. You should also learn to distinguish between a broken promise and a poorly designed promise. If you repeatedly fail to follow through, do not automatically conclude that you lack character. Examine the commitment itself. Was the time unrealistic? Did you underestimate the difficulty? Did you depend on conditions that rarely existed? Did you create too many competing obligations? Did you fail to account for predictable fatigue? Responsibility means taking ownership of the result, but ownership includes examining the system that produced the result. You are not required to defend a bad plan simply because you created it. At the same time, be careful not to turn reflection into endless revision. Some people respond to failure by redesigning their entire routine every few days. They create a new schedule, a new tracking system, a new set of rules, and a new starting date. This can feel productive because planning provides emotional relief. But eventually, discipline requires a period in which you stop redesigning and start repeating. A commitment becomes meaningful through enough repetitions that your behavior begins to change. Constantly replacing the plan prevents you from discovering what consistent execution would actually produce. One of the most powerful ways to strengthen self-trust is to keep small promises that have no audience. If you decide that you will put something away immediately instead of leaving it for later, do it. If you decide to read 10 pages before entertainment, honor that decision. If you decide to complete a specific task before checking your phone, follow through. These actions may appear insignificant, but their psychological value comes from the fact that nobody needs to reward you. You are practicing the ability to act according to a decision simply because you decided it was important. This also changes how you respond to temptation. When you have repeatedly kept commitments, temptation becomes less confusing because you have a stronger expectation of what you will do. You may still want the easier option, but you no longer spend as much time debating it. The decision has a history behind it. You know that you have honored similar commitments before. That history reduces the need for dramatic self-talk. Discipline becomes less about convincing yourself and more about following a standard you have already established through behavior. There will still be failures. You will sometimes make a promise and break it. You will sometimes choose comfort, lose focus, misjudge your capacity, or simply have a bad day. The danger is not one failure. The danger is the story you tell yourself afterward. If you decide that one broken commitment proves you cannot trust yourself, you may use shame as a reason to stop trying. If you pretend the failure does not matter, you lose the opportunity to learn. A stronger response is direct and calm. Acknowledge what happened, identify why it happened, repair what can be repaired, and make the next commitment more intelligently. Eventually, the most meaningful change is not that difficult tasks become easy. It is that your own decisions begin carrying more weight. When you tell yourself that something will be done, you increasingly expect your future behavior to support that decision. You become less dependent on external pressure because your internal standard has become stronger. You no longer need to ask whether someone else will notice. You know that the person who benefits from your consistency is the person you are becoming. But this creates a new responsibility. Once you become more reliable, it is tempting to respond by making every commitment more demanding. You prove that you can keep one promise, so you immediately create 5 more. You raise the standard until discipline becomes another source of unnecessary pressure. The next challenge is therefore not simply learning to keep promises. It is learning how to increase the demands you place on yourself without destroying the consistency that made those promises valuable in the first place. Chapter 8. Increase difficulty gradually without overwhelming your ability to remain consistent. Once you become more reliable with a commitment, a new temptation appears, increasing the difficulty too quickly. You complete a 30-minute workout for several weeks and decide that the next step must be 90 minutes every day. You successfully study for an hour and immediately create a 3-hour schedule. You manage to wake up consistently and decide that you should now wake up even earlier. Progress can create impatience because improvement feels rewarding, and that reward can make you want to accelerate. But discipline does not become stronger simply because the demands become larger. If the increase is poorly timed, you can turn a stable habit into an unstable one. The real skill is learning how to make your responsibilities more demanding while preserving your ability to continue. Consistency has a different psychology from intensity. Intensity can produce impressive results quickly, but consistency determines whether those results remain available. When you suddenly increase the difficulty of a behavior, your mind and body have to adapt to a larger demand before they have fully consolidated the previous one. The result may be enthusiasm for a few days, followed by exhaustion, frustration, or avoidance. This pattern can be confusing because the original behavior was working. The problem was not a lack of ability. The problem was that you increased the load faster than your capacity could adjust. Think about someone learning to run after being inactive. They walk regularly for several weeks and feel stronger, so they decide to run 5 miles every morning. The first few sessions may feel exciting because the change proves they are serious. But soon soreness appears, recovery becomes difficult, and the routine starts interfering with the rest of their life. They miss one day, then another, and eventually stop exercising altogether. A gradual increase might have looked less impressive, but it would have allowed the body to adapt while preserving the habit. The same principle applies to intellectual work, emotional discipline, professional responsibility, and almost every skill that depends on repeated effort. A useful question before increasing difficulty is not simply, "Can I do more?" It is, "Can I do more without making the behavior unreliable?" Those are different questions. You may be capable of completing a demanding task once while being unable to sustain that level several times a week. A person can work for 12 focused hours during a crisis, but that does not mean 12-hour workdays should become their normal standard. Someone can study for 6 hours before an examination, but that does not mean 6 hours of daily study is the best long-term method. Capacity at its maximum is not the same as capacity that can be repeated. This distinction protects you from confusing occasional performance with sustainable progress. Your goal is not to discover the greatest amount of effort you can produce under pressure. Your goal is to expand the amount of effort you can produce without depending on pressure. That requires patience because adaptation is often less dramatic than ambition. You may increase a workout by 10 minutes, add another focused work session, read a few more pages, or take on a slightly more difficult responsibility. The change may seem small, but if you can repeat it consistently, the small increase becomes meaningful because it raises your normal capacity rather than merely creating a temporary peak. Gradual difficulty also has a psychological advantage. When the increase is manageable, your mind receives repeated evidence that higher demands are possible. You are not constantly experiencing the shock of a completely new standard. You are becoming familiar with a larger level of effort. This matters because psychological resistance often responds to perceived size. A task that looks enormous can create immediate avoidance, while a task that is only slightly more demanding than what you already handle may feel challenging but acceptable. You can use that difference intelligently by increasing demands before your current level becomes completely effortless, but not so quickly that the new level feels unreasonable. There is no universal schedule for progression. One person may be ready to increase a workload after 2 weeks. Another may need several months. The relevant evidence comes from your actual behavior. Are you completing the current commitment reliably? Are you recovering adequately? Is the quality of your work stable? Are you beginning to resent the routine? Are you frequently compensating by neglecting sleep, relationships, or other responsibilities? These questions reveal whether your current level is becoming established or whether you are merely forcing yourself through it. Discipline includes observing the consequences of your effort instead of assuming that more effort is automatically better. This becomes especially important when ambition begins competing with judgment. You may see someone else's routine online and feel that your own progress is inadequate. Someone wakes at 4 in the morning, trains intensely, reads for hours, runs a business, and appears endlessly productive. You compare your current capacity with their most visible output and decide that you should increase your demands immediately. But you do not know their circumstances, history, resources, obligations, or private costs. Comparison can create a false sense of urgency. Your responsibility is not to imitate another person's maximum. It is to develop your own capacity intelligently. Another problem appears when people increase difficulty by adding too many dimensions at once. Imagine someone who wants to improve their health. Instead of changing one behavior, they eliminate every favorite food, begin exercising daily, wake earlier, stop going out, and create an aggressive sleep schedule. Each individual change might be reasonable, but together they create a completely different lifestyle overnight. The mind now has too many adjustments to manage. A better approach is to allow one change to become stable before introducing another major demand. This reduces cognitive load and makes it easier to determine which change is actually helping. The same principle applies to professional development. Suppose you have become consistent at completing 1 hour of focused work each morning. You could increase that to 90 minutes and observe what happens. If the new level remains stable, you might later increase it again or introduce a more difficult type of work. This creates a progression based on evidence. You are not constantly guessing what you can handle. You are testing a higher standard, observing the result, and adjusting accordingly. That process is slower than emotional overcommitment, but it produces information you can trust. You should also expect temporary setbacks when increasing difficulty. A new level of challenge may expose weaknesses that were hidden at the previous level. Perhaps you discover that your concentration declines after 90 minutes. Perhaps your recovery is insufficient. Perhaps the new workload creates scheduling conflicts. A setback does not necessarily mean the increase was a mistake. It may simply mean that you need to adjust the pace. Sometimes the intelligent response is to reduce the difficulty temporarily, stabilize the foundation, and then try again. Progress does not require a straight line. It requires a direction and a willingness to make corrections without abandoning the larger objective. There is a quiet discipline involved in refusing to progress for the sake of appearing disciplined. You may reach a level that is already demanding but sustainable, and feel pressure to make it more extreme. Resist that pressure when there is no practical reason for the increase. If your current exercise routine is improving your health, your study routine is producing strong learning, or your work schedule is producing meaningful results without damaging the rest of your life, you do not need to increase the difficulty simply because harder sounds better. The appropriate standard is effectiveness, not extremity. At the same time, comfort can become a problem if you remain at the same level forever. Once a behavior becomes automatic, it may stop developing the capacity you originally wanted to build. A person who always studies material they already understand may feel disciplined while avoiding intellectual challenge. Someone who exercises at the same intensity indefinitely may maintain fitness without improving it. Someone who always handles familiar responsibilities may become reliable without becoming more capable. Gradual progression prevents discipline from becoming mere repetition. You occasionally need to ask what the next reasonable demand should be. One practical way to think about progression is to change only one variable at a time. Increase duration, complexity, intensity, frequency, or responsibility, but avoid dramatically increasing all of them simultaneously. If you currently study for 45 minutes, perhaps increase the duration before also adding more difficult material. If you exercise 3 days a week, increase the quality of those sessions before immediately adding several more days. If you manage one difficult professional responsibility well, take on a slightly more complex version before doubling your workload. This allows you to identify what your system can handle and where adjustment is needed. The deeper lesson is that discipline is not measured by how much pressure you can survive. It is measured by how intelligently you can expand your ability to act. A person who repeatedly overwhelms themselves may look determined from the outside, while secretly training a cycle of overcommitment and withdrawal. A person who increases difficulty carefully may appear less dramatic, but becomes substantially more capable over time. Strength develops when demand and capacity remain close enough to challenge each other without destroying the foundation that supports them. Eventually, you reach a point where the difficulty of the task is no longer the only factor determining your performance. Recovery begins to influence everything. You can increase your workload, improve your focus, and become more disciplined. But if you never restore your physical and mental resources, your consistency will eventually decline. This creates the next question. How do you recover without turning recovery into another excuse to avoid difficult work? Learning that distinction may determine whether the discipline you are building can survive for years rather than only a few intense weeks. Chapter 9. Recover intelligently, so difficult daily actions remain sustainable over time. Recovery is often misunderstood by people who are serious about discipline. They imagine that rest belongs to people who are trying to escape effort, while strong people should keep pushing regardless of how depleted they become. That belief can produce impressive short-term effort, but it eventually creates a contradiction. You want to become someone who can do difficult things every day, yet you organize your life in a way that makes difficult action harder to repeat. Sustainable discipline requires more than the ability to push. It requires the judgment to recognize when pushing is productive, when recovery is necessary, and when exhaustion is beginning to distort your decisions. Consider a person who spends an entire week working late because an important project is approaching. They sleep less, skip exercise, eat irregularly, and use every available hour for work. The deadline passes, and instead of feeling accomplished, they feel mentally empty. For several days afterward, even ordinary tasks seem unusually demanding. They may interpret this as a failure of discipline and attempt to force themselves back into productivity. But the problem is not necessarily insufficient determination. Their system has accumulated a deficit that effort alone cannot erase. When recovery is ignored long enough, the ability to perform difficult actions declines, regardless of how strongly you want to continue. Recovery begins with understanding that human capacity is not a fixed supply available at the same level every day. Sleep, physical activity, nutrition, emotional stress, social demands, and mental workload all influence how well you can concentrate and regulate yourself. This does not mean you should become obsessed with optimizing every variable. It means you should stop treating depletion as irrelevant information. If you repeatedly notice that your performance deteriorates after several nights of poor sleep, the responsible response is not to criticize yourself for lacking motivation. It is to recognize that sleep is part of the system that allows discipline to function. Sleep is especially important because it affects more than physical energy. When you are severely tired, attention becomes less stable, emotional reactions can become stronger, and ordinary frustrations can feel more significant. A difficult task that would normally require patience may suddenly feel intolerable. You may become more likely to choose immediate rewards, postpone responsibilities, or react impulsively. This is why recovery should not be viewed as a reward that you earn after being productive enough. It is one of the conditions that allows you to make reasonable decisions when difficulty appears. The same principle applies to mental recovery. A person can spend an entire day consuming information and still feel as though they accomplished very little. Meetings, messages, notifications, decisions, reading, conversations, and constant problem-solving all place demands on attention. When the workday ends, many people continue stimulating their minds with endless scrolling, news, entertainment, or online discussions. They may call this relaxation, but not every form of stimulation produces genuine recovery. Sometimes the mind needs less input rather than more. A quiet walk, an unhurried meal, light movement, time with people you care about, or simply being away from constant digital demands can restore a different kind of capacity. This distinction matters because passive entertainment can become another form of avoidance. If you spend hours consuming content because you are too tired to do anything else, you may temporarily feel relief but remain mentally restless. The objective is not to label entertainment as bad. Enjoyment is part of a healthy life. The question is whether the activity leaves you more capable of returning to your responsibilities or simply keeps you occupied until you are ready for sleep. Recovery should reduce unnecessary strain rather than continuously replace one form of stimulation with another. Physical recovery also requires judgment. If you exercise regularly, some discomfort is expected, but constant exhaustion is not proof of commitment. Training places stress on the body so that adaptation can occur, but adaptation requires time. If you ignore persistent pain, severe fatigue, or declining performance because you believe stopping means weakness, you may create a problem that eventually forces a much longer interruption. Responsible discipline respects the difference between ordinary effort and signals that require attention. When symptoms are severe, persistent, or concerning, professional medical advice is appropriate rather than relying on willpower. There is a similar pattern in emotional work. Difficult conversations, family responsibilities, professional conflict, and personal setbacks can consume psychological energy even when you appear physically functional. You may finish the conversation successfully and then discover that your patience is unusually low for the rest of the day. If you interpret that reaction as a character flaw, you may become unnecessarily critical of yourself. A better response is to recognize that emotional effort has consequences. After demanding interpersonal situations, some quiet time may be necessary before you expect yourself to perform another difficult task at a high level. This is where stoic discipline requires more than endurance. It requires accurate judgment about what is within your control. You cannot command yourself to feel energetic at all times. You cannot eliminate every demanding period from life. You can, however, decide how you organize the conditions around your responsibilities. You can protect sleep when circumstances allow. You can schedule demanding work intelligently. You can avoid filling every free moment with stimulation. You can recognize when you need a genuine break instead of pretending that exhaustion is irrelevant. These are not departures from discipline, they are applications of it. One of the most useful questions during recovery is, what would allow me to return stronger rather than simply stop working? That question prevents two extremes. On one side is relentless pushing, where every sign of fatigue is treated as something to defeat. On the other is avoidance, where any discomfort becomes a reason to abandon responsibility. Intelligent recovery sits between them. You may decide to reduce the intensity of a workout rather than skip movement entirely. You may shorten a study session while preserving the habit of learning. You may finish the most important part of a task and postpone less urgent work. You may take an evening away from productivity so that tomorrow's effort is stronger. Recovery also becomes easier when you stop expecting every day to have identical output. Some days are naturally more demanding because of circumstances outside your control. A family issue may arise. Work may become unexpectedly complicated. Travel may disrupt your schedule. Poor sleep may happen despite your efforts. If you expect yourself to maintain peak performance, regardless of circumstances, you create unnecessary conflict between reality and expectation. A more resilient approach is to maintain the direction of your commitments while allowing the intensity to change. The goal is continuity, not identical performance every day. This does not mean using fatigue as a permanent excuse. That is why patterns matter. One difficult night of sleep should not automatically cancel every responsibility. But if you are repeatedly exhausted, constantly irritable, unable to concentrate, or losing interest in activities you normally handle well, the answer may not be greater discipline. It may be a problem with workload, sleep, stress, health, or recovery that deserves serious attention. Mature self-control includes the willingness to investigate the cause instead of endlessly demanding more effort from yourself. There is also value in planning recovery before you desperately need it. If you wait until you are completely depleted before resting, your recovery period may become much longer and less intentional. Instead, build ordinary periods of lower demand into your life. Protect a reasonable bedtime. Allow some time without work. Take breaks during extended periods of concentration. Use days of lower intensity when appropriate. These decisions prevent the cycle in which you spend everything you have and then require a complete shutdown before you can function again. Perhaps the most important change occurs when you stop viewing recovery as the opposite of discipline. Discipline is not simply the ability to force action. It is the ability to govern your behavior according to what matters, including the conditions required to continue pursuing what matters. If your goal is to become someone who can handle difficult responsibilities over many years, then preserving your ability to act is itself a responsibility. A person who understands this does not rest because effort is meaningless. They rest because effort has meaning and therefore deserves to be sustained intelligently. There will still be times when you have to work while tired, act while uncomfortable, or continue despite imperfect conditions. Life will not always provide ideal recovery. The point is not to wait for perfect circumstances. It is to avoid creating unnecessary depletion and then calling the consequences a test of character. When circumstances demand more, you respond. When circumstances allow recovery, you use it wisely. This flexibility makes discipline more durable because it is based on reality rather than rigid self-punishment. Eventually, something deeper becomes visible. The goal was never simply to become better at forcing yourself through unpleasant moments. The goal was to become capable of directing your life consistently, including knowing when to push, when to adjust, and when to recover. Once those skills work together, difficult actions become less dependent on temporary motivation. But there is still one final challenge. A person can become disciplined, organized, resilient, and consistent, yet still struggle when progress becomes slow and the original excitement disappears. The final question is whether you can continue choosing meaningful difficulty when there is no immediate reward, no dramatic transformation, and no guarantee that anyone will notice. Chapter 10. Transform disciplined effort into a dependable identity that welcomes challenges. Eventually, discipline becomes more powerful when it stops feeling like something you are temporarily doing and becomes part of how you understand yourself. At the beginning, you may need reminders, schedules, rules, and deliberate effort to complete difficult tasks. That is normal. You are building a pattern before you fully believe in it. But after enough consistent decisions, something changes. You begin to expect yourself to act when something matters. You no longer see every difficult responsibility as a special event that requires extraordinary motivation. It becomes part of ordinary life. The challenge is still real, but your relationship with the challenge has changed. Identity is often misunderstood as a statement about personality. People say they are disciplined, lazy, ambitious, inconsistent, strong, or weak, as though these qualities are permanent descriptions. In reality, much of what you call your identity is influenced by repeated behavior. When you repeatedly respond to difficulty with avoidance, you begin to expect avoidance from yourself. When you repeatedly respond with deliberate action, you develop a different expectation. This does not mean you should pretend to be someone you are not. It means your actions provide evidence about the kind of person you are becoming, and that evidence can gradually change your self-concept. Imagine someone who has spent years believing that they are not good at difficult work. They avoid complex projects, delay uncomfortable conversations, and quit new activities when progress becomes frustrating. Then they begin changing one behavior at a time. They finish what they start more often. They follow through on commitments. They stay with difficult work longer. They recover intelligently instead of abandoning the process after a setback. After months of this, saying "I am not disciplined" becomes harder to believe because their behavior no longer supports the statement. Their identity has begun changing through evidence rather than positive thinking. This is important because identity can influence future decisions. When a difficult opportunity appears, you do not approach it from a blank psychological state. You bring assumptions about what you normally do. A person who sees themselves as someone who avoids challenge may immediately search for reasons to decline. A person who sees themselves as someone who can handle demanding responsibilities may still feel uncertainty, but they are less likely to interpret uncertainty as a reason to retreat. The second person does not necessarily have greater confidence. They have a different expectation about their own response. That expectation can become especially valuable when there is no immediate reward. Many people can work hard when the result is visible, praise is available, or excitement is high. The deeper test arrives when the task becomes ordinary. Nobody compliments you for completing another study session. Nobody celebrates another workout. Nobody notices that you kept working on a difficult skill after your progress slowed. If your behavior depends on recognition, consistency becomes fragile. A dependable identity allows you to continue because the standard comes from within. The action matters even when nobody is watching. This does not mean you should become rigid or obsessed with proving your discipline. A strong identity is not a prison. You are allowed to change goals, reconsider commitments, rest, and admit when a strategy is ineffective. In fact, a person who is secure in their identity can make these adjustments without feeling that every change represents failure. If you identify completely with a particular routine, then changing the routine may feel like losing yourself. But if your deeper identity is based on responsible action, learning, and self-command, you can change the method while preserving the principle. This distinction becomes important as life changes. The schedule that worked when you were single may not work when you have new family responsibilities. The study routine that worked during school may not work during a demanding job. The exercise program that suited you at one stage of life may become inappropriate later. If discipline means following one exact system forever, it will eventually break. If discipline means taking responsibility for your actions under changing circumstances, it can adapt without disappearing. The identity becomes more durable because it is attached to principles rather than temporary conditions. There is also a danger in becoming proud of hardship itself. Once you learn that you can tolerate difficult things, you may begin choosing difficulty simply because it feels demanding. You might take on unnecessary obligations, refuse convenient solutions, or believe that an easier method somehow makes your achievement less valuable. That is not mature discipline. The purpose of doing hard things is not to make life unnecessarily difficult. It is to develop the ability to do what is necessary even when it requires effort. If a task can be completed intelligently with less wasted energy, choosing the efficient approach is not weakness. It is good judgment. Welcoming challenges, therefore, does not mean seeking suffering. It means becoming less threatened by legitimate difficulty. When an opportunity requires learning something unfamiliar, you can approach it with curiosity instead of immediately deciding that you are not ready. When a responsibility requires patience, you can recognize that patience itself is part of the work. When a mistake exposes a weakness, you can examine the weakness instead of protecting your pride. When a difficult conversation is necessary, you can value honesty over temporary comfort. The challenge becomes something to evaluate and engage with, rather than something to automatically avoid. This approach also changes failure. If your identity depends on always succeeding, failure becomes dangerous because it threatens your sense of self. You may avoid difficult situations where failure is possible simply to preserve the appearance of competence. But if your identity is based on responsible effort and continued learning, failure can become information. You can ask what happened, what you misunderstood, what skill was missing, and what needs to change. The event remains disappointing, but it no longer has to become a judgment about your worth. You can experience a poor result without becoming a person who believes they are incapable. There is a practical way to reinforce this identity. Pay attention to the evidence you create each day. At the end of a demanding day, you do not need a dramatic review of your entire life. Ask yourself whether your actions supported the person you are trying to become. Did you keep an important commitment? Did you respond responsibly when something went wrong? Did you complete a difficult task instead of avoiding it? Did you recover when necessary without turning recovery into escape? Did you make a better decision after recognizing a mistake? These questions focus attention on behavior rather than mood. Over time, this creates a quiet form of confidence. You do not need to tell yourself that you can handle anything. You know that some things will exceed your current ability. You know that certain situations will frighten you, frustrate you, or require more preparation than expected. But you also know that difficulty does not automatically control your behavior. You have developed a history of responding. That history becomes psychologically valuable because it gives you something stronger than temporary encouragement, evidence that you can rely on yourself. A dependable identity also changes the way you approach new challenges. Instead of asking, "How do I make myself want to do this?" you may begin asking, "What does this situation require from me?" The first question centers on preference. The second centers on responsibility. If the task matters, you determine what preparation is needed, what standard is reasonable, when the work should happen, and how you will respond when resistance appears. You are no longer waiting for an emotional state to authorize action. You are approaching the situation as someone who expects to participate actively in their own decisions. This is where discipline becomes less about force and more about character. Character is revealed through patterns of choice, especially when circumstances are inconvenient. You cannot create a dependable identity by thinking about discipline. You create it by repeatedly giving yourself reasons to trust your own behavior. Every completed commitment adds evidence. Every thoughtful correction adds evidence. Every difficult situation handled without unnecessary avoidance adds evidence. One decision may feel insignificant, but a long series of decisions changes what you expect from yourself. There will always be days when you fall short. You will procrastinate sometimes. You will lose focus. You will become tired, impatient, distracted, or discouraged. Becoming disciplined does not eliminate these experiences. It changes what happens afterward. Instead of turning one failure into an excuse for continued failure, you return to responsibility. You correct the behavior, make the next decision, and continue. The ability to return may ultimately matter more than the ability to perform perfectly, because life will repeatedly give you circumstances that no plan can completely control. And perhaps this is the deepest reason to become comfortable with difficult things. Difficulty is not a temporary feature of life that you eventually graduate from. New responsibilities will continue to appear, your goals will change, your abilities will expand, and so will the level of challenge available to you. A discipline that depends on everything becoming easier will eventually fail. A discipline built around the willingness to meet reality as it is can continue developing throughout your life. The person you become is shaped not only by the goals you achieve, but by what you repeatedly choose when achievement is uncertain. You may never feel completely ready. You may never eliminate resistance. You may never reach a point where every difficult task feels natural. That is not a problem to solve. It is part of being human. The meaningful achievement is becoming someone who can face that reality without surrendering responsibility for their actions. So when tomorrow brings another difficult task, you do not need to create a new version of yourself before beginning. You only need to act in a way that is consistent with the person you have been practicing becoming. Do the necessary work. Adjust when reality requires adjustment. Rest when recovery is necessary. Return after failure. Accept that discomfort may be present. And when a new challenge appears, resist the instinct to ask whether life should be easier. Ask a more useful question. What is this challenge asking me to become capable of? Because the moment you begin answering that question through action, discipline stops being something you force yourself to practice and becomes a way of living that can keep expanding with you.